We are taught that history is shaped by official institutions. We look to senates passing laws, monarchs issuing decrees, and armies securing borders to understand how the world works. But when the official record fractures, a very different reality emerges. Formal systems of power are inherently rigid. They move slowly, they exclude the vast majority of the population, and they frequently fail to protect the very people they claim to serve. When formal authority falls short, humans build shadow structures, unconventional networks of perception, shared symbolism, and quiet influence that operate in the gaps left by the law. To accurately map the mechanics of human society, we have to close the written rulebooks. We have to examine the hidden tools people actually use to seize control when the system denies them a seat at the table. Recognizing these shadow structures shifts the focus of history. It reveals that the most impactful decisions often happen far from the throne room, in spaces the official records were never meant to track. In ancient Rome, the Republic operated on a promise of shared power. Decisions were officially governed by rigorous debate, elegant Latin speeches, and strict laws negotiated inside the Senate. In practice, ambitious politicians like Publius Clodius Pulcher and Titus Annius Milo learned to bypass the Senate. They weaponized civilian loyalty, organizing their followers into aggressive, highly coordinated street gangs. Their logic was strictly tactical. By physically dominating the public spaces where voting and debate occurred, they blocked rival citizens from participating. If your opponents cannot safely stand in the forum, the formal laws of the Republic become entirely theoretical. These intimidation tactics escalated until they destroyed the foundations of the government. Following Clodius's death, his supporters carried his body into the political center of Rome and burned the Curia Julia, the Senate house itself, to the ground. Roman street politics reveals how physical force renders written laws obsolete. Once the forum was lost to the gangs, the shared governance of the Republic vanished, clearing the path for the absolute control of the empire. Centuries later in Tudor England, official justice was supposedly monopolized by King Henry VIII and the heavy physical architecture of his court. Yet Queen Anne Boleyn was destroyed without a single piece of hard physical evidence. Her downfall came through a different mechanism, a narrative orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell bypassed the need for proof. He organized the loose whispers drifting through the palace, twisted innocent interactions into dangerous rumors, and extracted forced confessions to build a new, dark reality for the king. By the time Anne stood before a panel of nobles, her formal trial was nothing more than bureaucratic theater. The legal proceedings were designed to legitimize an outcome that the shadow structure had already decided behind closed doors. In environments where survival depends on royal favor and reputation, controlling the narrative is a more lethal weapon than the formal legal process. We see a similar dynamic in the American Wild West. The frontier was ostensibly governed by a strict hierarchy of lawmen, wealthy businessmen, and gunslingers enforcing order, but an invisible network operated right in front of them. Saloon girls navigated these volatile spaces by projecting harmlessness, making themselves appear almost invisible to the men fighting for dominance. Because the men assumed these women weren't listening, they spoke freely. The women quietly absorbed complaints, poker strategies, and business plans, functioning as highly efficient social intelligence hubs. They deployed this intelligence with extreme precision. A carefully timed whisper or a subtle rumor could alter a cowboy's reputation, shift the alliances in the room, and influence high-stakes financial deals without anyone tracing the shift back to the source. Social intelligence operates as a powerful shadow structure. It allows individuals denied a place in official hierarchies to guide the outcomes of those sitting at the top. This reliance on perception is an ancient instinct. We traditionally measure prehistoric human existence through the blunt physical metrics of survival: hunting for food, securing shelter, and fighting off predators. Archaeology from Blombos Cave reveals a different priority. Early humans expended massive amounts of time and energy altering simple materials into purely symbolic objects. Long before written language, humans used visual adornments to communicate their identity and signal alliances to the group. In a world where isolation meant death, these markers signaled who belonged and who could be trusted. By establishing this visual language of cooperation, early humans used perception to secure the protection of the group, the most effective survival tool they had. The armed mobs in Rome, the devastating whispers of Tudor England, the quiet intelligence of the saloon, and the prehistoric shell beads all expose the exact same principle. Official laws, royal titles, and state institutions do not possess inherent strength. They only maintain power for as long as a collective belief in them is upheld. The moment that belief cracks, the formal illusion shatters. Real authority instantly flows into the hands of those commanding the shadow structures. These informal networks are not historical anomalies. They are the engines driving societal change whenever the official rules fail to hold society together. True influence rarely requires a crown or a badge. Throughout all of human history, the world has been quietly steered by those who master perception. We like to imagine the medieval world as a place of bold explorers, chivalric courts, and sweeping adventures. But the reality for most people was a daily, brutal fight against the mud, the cold, and sheer exhaustion. Survival depended on navigating massive environmental and social systems. These structures operated with a cold efficiency, indifferent to your personal comfort or your individual agency. To outlast this era, you had to master a specific kind of unyielding endurance. That grit was tested on two opposite fronts: the demand for relentless physical motion across deadly landscapes, and the weight of inescapable social confinement. Understanding history requires looking past the myths of glory. It means looking closely at what it actually took to endure environments and power structures that were designed to prioritize the collective over the individual. The Silk Road operated as a highly organized, moving machine. If you joined a caravan, you became a functional component of that system, as replaceable as the cargo strapped to the animals around you. The pace was set, and if you fell behind, you were left behind. The environment itself tested the limits of human biology. The lack of shelter meant enduring a jarring daily cycle, baking in relentless desert heat at noon, then facing a sharp, freezing drop in temperature the moment the sun disappeared. This chart shows the narrow margins of survival, a limited water supply against vast distance. If you suffered a broken axle, progress stopped, but thirst didn't. The distance marker stalls, the water line plummets to zero, turning delay into a death sentence. The need to bridge these immense landscapes eventually birthed the Mongol Yam. This was a postal network built for enforced high-speed motion across the vast expanse of the Asian steppe, connecting an empire faster than most armies could march. For the messengers, life was a cycle of riding through severe weather and pitch darkness. They were forced to steal fragmented minutes of sleep in a saddle while maintaining a full gallop. In this system, the message mattered more than the person carrying it. To maintain this momentum, riders carried a paisa, a metal tablet proving their state authority. Presenting this allowed a messenger to seize fresh horses and food from any local village, overriding local needs to ensure the message never stopped moving. In both the trade caravan and the imperial postal network, the momentum of the system was absolute. Survival meant pushing the human body past its breaking point, because a loss of momentum often resulted in total failure. While some were pushed to move, others were forced to stay still. In the rigid social hierarchies of medieval Europe, survival often required the psychological stamina to endure absolute, inescapable confinement. Eleanor of Aquitaine brought immense wealth and territory to two successive kings, yet she consistently rejected the quiet, invisible submission that medieval society expected of a royal wife, insisting on exerting political influence in a world run by men. Her defiance grew from political maneuvers during the Crusades to an open military rebellion alongside her own sons. She challenged the authority of King Henry II of England, seeking to dismantle his control over her lands and her family. When the rebellion collapsed, Henry responded with isolation. He ordered Eleanor into strict confinement, keeping her under heavy guard for 15 years, in a deliberate attempt to erase her from the political landscape. She outlasted her captor through sheer force of will. Upon Henry's death, she stepped out of her prison as an older woman and immediately reclaimed absolute control of the kingdom, governing while her son Richard was away at war. Beyond the stone walls of a nunnery, thousands of other women faced a different kind of life sentence. These institutions were designed to be sealed worlds, where every hour was governed by a rigid schedule of silence and labor. For many noble families, these convents served a practical economic function. Placing a daughter in a nunnery allowed a family to protect an inheritance and avoid paying an expensive dowry, effectively removing her from the social game. Trapping women in forced isolation under absolute rules often backfired. The heavily structured environment created a pressure cooker where human nature pushed back against the constant demand for obedience and silence. Behind closed doors, required silences were broken, and secret internal alliances formed. The church worked to discipline these women quietly, desperate to keep the rumors of hidden relationships and internal rebellion from reaching the outside world. When a society engineers systems of absolute confinement, the nature of human endurance shifts. It becomes a quiet, relentless resistance against the attempt to strip away your identity. A merchant crossing the Gobi and a queen in a stone tower occupied different worlds, but they both navigated a similarly narrow margin of survival. They were both subject to systems that left no room for individual error. Both the natural environment and the social hierarchies of the medieval world functioned by stripping individuals of their options and agency. These systems maintained their power by demanding that people either move or stay exactly as they were told. To grasp the past, we have to look past the romanticized legends. We have to recognize the grinding reality of outlasting structures that saw human beings as tools for efficiency or stability. Surviving the medieval world was an act of unyielding endurance. The stubborn, quiet refusal to stop moving or to stop resisting, regardless of how hard the system tried to break you. History often presents itself as a rigid archive, a ledger of undeniable facts, exact coordinates, and verified dates. But the record is essentially a series of performances. It was written by storytellers who understood that a tactical blend of literal truth and strategic exaggeration creates the greatest impact. We can trace this selective memory through a legendary traveler, a lost ancient wonder, a world-conquering king, and the oldest beverage on Earth. In the evolution of human civilization, a well-constructed myth provides a stronger foundation for society than literal truth alone. Narrative is the engine that drives progress. Take Marco Polo. His famous account has a compromised origin. Decades of memory dictated to a professional romance writer while they were both stuck in a Genoese prison cell. Their collaboration prioritized high-impact storytelling over mundane observation. Major features of Chinese life, tea, chopsticks, and the Great Wall, were omitted entirely. Polo skipped the physical realities that would have defined any literal travelogue. Yet this diagram shows the highly advanced administrative reality Polo actually discovered. He accurately reported on a Mongol trade network powered by state-controlled paper currency, a system so far beyond the comprehension of medieval Europe that most readers assumed he was dreaming. Polo secured his audience's interest by positioning himself at the center of these verified systems, claiming the Khan sent him on official missions as a trusted advisor. He adopted the role of the primary witness to ensure his descriptions carried the weight of authority. This dramatized version of the East functioned as an early form of marketing. By creating an irresistible myth of wealth and order, Polo provided the narrative fuel that inspired explorers like Columbus to map the real world. History's most durable romantic monument, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, follows a similar script. The story describes a towering, impossible green paradise built in a desert by a king for his homesick wife. These flat, mud brick foundations are all excavations in Babylon have ever found. There is zero physical evidence of massive terraced structures. Later storytellers likely attached the legend to Babylon because the city's name carried epic cultural weight, ignoring physical reality. The actual ruins of such a garden exist miles away in Nineveh. King Sennacherib left behind stone aqueducts and detailed inscriptions describing the exact engineering feats that the legend later misattributed to Babylon. Over centuries, the poetic image of Babylon grew, while the geography of Nineveh faded. The myth of a desert paradise proved so durable that it replaced the literal location in our collective memory. Alexander the Great weaponized his own biography by modeling his actions after Achilles. He used myth to transform his campaign from a military invasion into a living epic. The literal reality was a rapid, brutal dismantling of the Persian Empire. These charred killers at Persepolis stand as the physical proof of his arrival, a calculated destruction of the empire's cultural heart. To stabilize the fractured territory, Alexander adopted Persian royal customs, demanding the ritual of proskynesis to establish his legitimacy as a divine successor. He shifted his persona from a foreign invader to a living god. This mythical performance alienated his Macedonian officers, leading to mutiny and the eventual fracturing of his territory. Upon his sudden death, the unified empire he had forced into existence immediately collapsed. His physical kingdom failed, but his performance as a hero forced the permanent blending of Greek and Persian civilizations. The myth achieved the cultural integration that his armies could not sustain. Even basic survival tools were subject to this process. In the ancient world, water was often unsafe, making a thick mixture of fermented grain the most reliable source of hydration and calories. This tablet shows how early states codified biological needs into an economic system, using beer as standardized currency to pay thousands of laborers. They then anchored this in religious frameworks, inventing goddesses to govern brewing, allowing for strict, centralized social control. Mythologizing this daily necessity provided the economic and spiritual glue required to stabilize early human civilization. The Explorer's Diary, The Lost Garden, The God King, and The Sacred Drink all follow a single pattern. Humanity does not run on raw data, we run on narratives. The exact coordinates of a structure or the flaws of a leader matter far less than the stories we tell about them. We prioritize the narrative over the ledger. These historical exaggerations function as tools. They inspire collective action and create the cultural cohesion necessary for civilizations to endure. When examining history, the most revealing question is not, is this true, but rather, why did we need this to be true? Our stories are what build the future. We have a highly specific image of how ancient knowledge died. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt and supposedly set a fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria, wiping out centuries of human thought overnight. History rarely offers such a neat, cinematic villain. The decline of Alexandria was actually a slow, quiet process of neglect. The collection's true vulnerability was the papyrus itself. It was a fragile material that cracked under humidity and tore easily, and naturally decomposed over time. Outpacing that decay demanded a massive, expensive system of human labor. Armies of scribes had to constantly copy and recopy texts by hand just to keep the information intact. Permanence is a complete illusion. Great human achievements do not survive by default. They persist only through an exhaustingly active, continuous process of maintenance. When the Roman Empire absorbed Egypt, the library's royal funding dried up. Roman administrators prioritized taxation and military control over maintaining obscure philosophical arguments. By the late 4th century, ideological priorities shifted dramatically. The rise of Christianity meant pagan philosophies and ancient texts were reclassified from intellectual treasures to obsolete, dangerous relics. This chart illustrates the mechanics of loss. A drop in preservation funding intersects with a rising line representing ideological shift, causing actively copied texts to plummet to zero. As scribes put down their pens, the papyrus rotted. Entire branches of science vanished in total silence. A society doesn't need to intentionally destroy what it hates. It merely has to stop actively funding and maintaining what it no longer values. This relentless need for active maintenance applies equally to political survival. At the Tudor court of Henry VIII, power demanded its own brutal daily upkeep. Royal feasts featured an overwhelming, gluttonous scale of consumption, endless courses of roasted meats, and extremely rare, towering sugar sculptures deployed as deliberate displays of wealth. Eating at this level was strictly performative. Showing restraint or stopping early signaled weakness to the fiercely competitive nobles watching the table. Maintaining political relevance is an exhausting, continuous physical performance. Psychological and cultural systems require that exact same level of continuous labor. Ancient Romans, for example, viewed sleep as a vulnerable state where the gods delivered direct omens. These dreams were treated as literal blueprints of fate. Ignoring a troubling vision before a military campaign or a political decision was a massive gamble. Managing this belief system required a dedicated industry. Romans utilized priests, performed temple incubation rituals, and debated symbols publicly to translate those night visions into actionable strategy. Even abstract concepts like destiny only dictate reality when a society collectively and continuously works to interpret and enforce them. When the effort to maintain a system stops, even the most solid physical structures collapse. Deep inside a harsh desert canyon sits Petra, a heavily engineered city carved entirely into rock. Petra's wealth relied on a strict geographic monopoly. It operated as the unavoidable checkpoint for land-based caravan trade routes, moving spices and incense. As maritime shipping routes expanded, traders quickly realized they could bypass the harsh desert entirely, instantly stripping Petra of its economic utility. No opposing army breached Petra's canyons in a grand siege. Once the trade routes shifted, its complex water systems and bustling markets were simply abandoned to the elements. Monuments of solid stone cannot outlast their own economic irrelevance. When a system bypasses them, they quietly turn into ghosts. We tend to look at fragile papyrus or abandoned stone cities and assume modern technology has solved the problem of permanence. Our early attempts to transition knowledge from paper to data relied on bulky magnetic tape drives and vintage terminals. Today, we've upgraded to endless rows of black server racks and blinking lights. Yet the fundamental requirement remains exactly the same. Digital data still demands constant cooling, continuous power, and active migration to outrun format decay. Neglecting these systems carries a completely invisible cost. The decay erases documented history, along with the unformed ideas, early drafts, and unconnected discoveries that vanish without leaving a single trace. The greatest threat to our modern achievements is our own overconfidence, the assumption that our systems will automatically preserve themselves without active human intervention. History is a fragile sequence of survival. Forgetting what we once knew quietly narrows the possibilities of our future, making the act of remembering our most critical daily task. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, historians spent centuries imagining something almost tasteful. We pictured citizens frozen mid-action, like carefully arranged statues, as if the entire population politely agreed to become a museum exhibit. This cinematic, paused painting view of history is almost entirely wrong. As archaeologists dig deeper, they find that our favorite tidy narratives and sudden catastrophes are often just inventions of selective storytelling. Consider the claim that the Roman Empire ended by poisoning themselves with lead water pipes. It's an elegant theory that cracks under the evidence. Mineral deposits formed inside these pipes over time, creating a natural barrier preventing lead from leaching into the water. Furthermore, chemical analysis of Roman skeletons shows lead levels far too low to trigger the mass cognitive collapse required to bring down an empire. Stressed, adaptable humans built this world, leaving behind a messy record that bears little resemblance to the stoic marble statues we've come to expect. Their complex lives required constant improvisation, exactly like our own. Pompeii was a drawn-out disaster, unfolding over hours. People spent that time navigating cycles of denial, hesitation, and failed packing. Archaeologists found half-prepared meals and valuables gathered but never taken, reflecting the confusion of humans who assumed the ground would eventually stop shaking. Average Romans lived in a world where glamorous home kitchens were a rarity. Most people lived in small, cramped apartments, where open cooking flames were an unacceptable fire hazard in a crowded city. This lack of home kitchens created a massive reliance on fast food. Entire streets were lined with thermopolia, street-side shops where Romans pointed to built-in clay jars filled with hot stews or lentils. It was an ancient business model built entirely on speed and convenience. Roman civic life was unedited and chaotic. On the walls of cities like Pompeii, citizens used red and white fresco space to carve crude jokes, aggressive political endorsements, and personal complaints about their neighbors. Yet this messy daily life was supported by surprisingly structured medical systems. Professional surgical kits have been uncovered, containing scalpels, forceps, and probes designed for specific, delicate procedures, like using needles to displace clouded lenses during cataract surgery. Modern city living follows these same ancient patterns: the drive for convenience, the need for public expression, and the practical struggle for daily survival. Roman infrastructure occasionally humiliates modern engineering. Their concrete doesn't just survive in seawater, it uses a mix of volcanic ash and lime to trigger a chemical reaction. This process forms new, interlocking crystals that actively fill in cracks and strengthen the structure over 2 millennia. Social structures were equally sophisticated. Gladiators often operated as volunteer celebrities, signing lucrative contracts for status and fan clubs. This was a structured, high-stakes entertainment industry where experienced fighters were treated as valuable investments rather than disposable victims. Roman women used unofficial power to defy legal restrictions, managing massive estates and running businesses. They navigated the system with such effective subtlety that their economic influence was often hidden behind the official male-dominated records. Rome also functioned as an early participant in global trade. Their markets relied on a connected network that stretched to Asia, with Roman merchants importing spices, gemstones, and silks from thousands of kilometers away to maintain the appearance of imperial success. Contrast this global awareness with the Roman dodecahedron, a mass-produced bronze object with 12 sides and corner knobs. Thousands have been found across Europe, yet the Romans never wrote down its purpose or provided a single instruction manual for its use. This lack of documentation leaves a permanent, humbling hole in our understanding. It suggests, while we map their trade routes, some common aspects of their daily lives remain completely out of reach. Historical assumptions usually link power to endless conquest, but the Ming Dynasty provides a shocking counterexample. Admiral Zheng He commanded a fleet of floating cities larger than anything the world had ever seen, dwarfing contemporary European vessels. This fleet projected Ming wealth and order through sheer scale. They visited foreign ports to secure global tribute and recognition, using the undeniable sight of their towering masts to establish dominance without the need for constant military occupation. Then, the Ming Dynasty suddenly and deliberately stopped the expeditions. They turned their focus inward, deciding that the resources required to project power across oceans were better spent on domestic priorities. The physical evidence of this staggering achievement, the timber, the shipyards, and the vast logistics, was systematically abandoned. An era of global maritime influence was allowed to fade into silence by a calculated internal decision. History is shaped as much by calculated restraint as it is by expansion. Sometimes the most significant shift in imperial power is the choice to simply walk away. Power ends with a slow, agonizing erosion rather than a cinematic finale. After their defeat at Actium, Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt, while life in the city continued with an insulting normality. Octavian avoided a rapid, dramatic attack. He preferred a methodical isolation, slowly choking off their allies, resources. He simply waited as time and distance became his most effective weapons. Antony psychologically eroded under this patient pressure. As his forces broke apart and commanders defected, the certainty that once defined him gave way to a persistent, quiet doubt that anything could be salvaged. The end for these great historical figures was a grueling realization that the future had already chosen a different side. They were no longer fighting a war, they were merely waiting for the inevitable. Cleopatra made a cold, highly calculated decision to control her own legacy. She refused to let Octavian parade her through Rome as a symbol of his victory, choosing to end her story on her own terms before she could be reduced to a trophy. This personal erosion mirrors the broader decline of the empire itself. Rome eroded like a coastline, piece by piece, as political instability and economic strain worked together over centuries. This transformation was so gradual that daily life continued uninterrupted. People living through this period didn't realize their world was ending because the systems they relied on didn't vanish. They simply became something unrecognizable. Furthermore, the eastern half of the empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 years after the fall in the West. It is a fact that refuses to fit into any tidy narrative of a sudden, total collapse. When we stop viewing the ancients through cinematic myths, we find a record of human adaptability. Their slow downfalls and messy daily lives are not just historical artifacts, they are reflections of our own world. In the dry heat of 1922, Howard Carter stood before a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings. That stone barrier had remained undisturbed for 3,000 years, serving as history's most literal "do not enter" sign. Human curiosity operates on an irrational instinct. We are drawn to explore and challenge the very things that systems of control, whether physical or biological, work to keep hidden. Historical breakthroughs are often framed as sequences of romantic discoveries. In practice, they are collisions between individual ambition and the rigid boundaries built to maintain an established order. The most enduring parts of history are defined by this friction. We invent myths to explain it, but the reality is a persistent battle between the drive to know and the systems designed to contain that knowledge. By breaching the seal on Tutankhamun's tomb, Carter's team disturbed an environment that had been chemically and biologically isolated for 3 millennia. Inside, layers of ancient organic material had slowly broken down in total darkness, releasing ammonia and hydrogen sulfide into the stagnant air. Centuries of Aspergillus mold spores settled over every surface, creating a toxic, microscopic landscape that the team inhaled without any form of respiratory protection. When the expedition's financier, Lord Carnarvon, died shortly after the opening, 1920s media used the Pharaoh's curse to fill the information gap. The narrative of supernatural revenge was far more profitable than a medical report. In reality, Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite. He accidentally nicked the wound while shaving, leading to blood poisoning in an era before widespread antibiotic treatment. However, the public's belief in the curse created a physical hazard of its own. This is the nocebo effect. The psychological stress of believing one is doomed can spike cortisol levels and suppress the immune system, making the tomb's actual biological spores significantly more dangerous. The curse was the result of human curiosity colliding with environmental confinement. Ambition pushed the team into a space where biology, not magic, had been waiting for 3,000 years. The Roman Empire specialized in a different kind of confinement. To expand his territory, Julius Caesar had to dismantle the Gallic resistance led by Vercingetorix, a king who had achieved the unprecedented feat of uniting the Gallic tribes. Vercingetorix surrendered honorably at Alesia to save his people from starvation. Caesar accepted the weapons of his enemy and immediately transitioned from military commander to public relations strategist. Instead of an immediate execution, Vercingetorix was moved to the Tullianum, a lightless underground prison. He remained there for 6 years, completely removed from his people and the flow of Gallic history. Caesar finally resurrected the captive during his grand triumph in Rome. Vercingetorix was paraded through the streets in chains as a theatrical prop, a visual proof of Caesar's dominance, before being returned to the dark and quietly strangled. Rome's strategy was focused on repurposing the threat. By keeping Vercingetorix in isolation, they ensured he would only reappear as a symbol of the empire's invincibility, stripping him of his individual agency before his death. Even the drive for creative expression faced systematic containment. The popular image of the lone, inspired medieval artist often overlooks the rigid structures that governed their work. Artistic life was regulated by the guild system. These organizations acted as a filter, controlling who was allowed to paint, sculpt, or mix pigments. Survival as an artist meant navigating a gauntlet of economic and social rules. The guilds dictated the use of expensive materials like gold leaf and lapis lazuli. They fixed prices, prohibited open competition between workshops, and enforced stylistic consistency. Deviation from these standards was often treated as a violation of professional trust rather than an innovation. Within this system, individual identity was secondary to market stability. Artistic creativity was only permitted to exist as long as it followed the strict, established rules of the collective. If the history of humanity is a sequence of environmental, political, and societal walls, progress depends on the outliers who find the cracks. Leonardo da Vinci spent his life testing the limits of every system he encountered. He rejected biological routine by adopting polyphasic sleep, resting in 15-minute bursts to maximize his waking hours. He maintained a vegetarian diet based on his own moral principles, ignoring the cultural and social norms of the Italian Renaissance. He bypassed the societal taboos of the era by conducting nighttime dissections on human cadavers. These illicit studies were his only way to accurately document the mechanics of the human body, moving past traditional anatomical theories. His notebooks detail machines that ignored 15th century limits. He sketched flying devices anticipating modern engineering by centuries. Even his handwriting rejected standard rules. He recorded observations in backwards mirror writing, remaining legible to him while avoiding messy fresh ink. This obsession with the process meant he often ignored the traditional goal of completion. He carried the Mona Lisa for years, adjusting minute details as his understanding of light and shadow evolved, famously refusing to declare the work finished. The stories we use to simplify history, vengeful pharaohs or glorious empires, often mask the underlying friction. Systems of stone, power, and economics are designed to hold a line, while individual curiosity is a persistent pressure that eventually finds a way through. Given the biological reality of the air inside King Tut's tomb, would you have been the one to break the seal? Let us know in the comments. If you're interested in the messy realities of history, like and subscribe for more.
History is filled with scenes that look like a fever dream. Professional mourners crying for strangers, warriors drawing their steel over a cut of meat, and an unpredictable, city-wide revelry that lasted until dawn. These behaviors look unhinged compared to the modern world, where we rely on digital communication, climate modeling, and medical science to maintain our stability. But ancient civilizations lacked our modern safety nets. For them, a sudden plague, a flash flood, or a shift in political mood was an existential threat that could erase an entire city in a single season. To survive this unpredictability, they built rituals. These bizarre practices acted as the invisible scaffolding of early society, forcing the terrifying randomness of existence into manageable, predictable boxes. In the humid climates of early Southeast Asia and Japan, food decay was a daily crisis. A successful catch of fish was a liability if it couldn't be kept from rotting before the next sunrise. To survive, they cleaned the fish, salted it, and packed it into cooked rice. Over months, the fermentation produced lactic acid, slowing bacterial growth and keeping the fish edible. This process, known as narazushi, turned a biological countdown into a long-term food supply. Beyond the pantry, the Greeks faced a different kind of decay, political ruin. To manage the paranoia of high-stakes decision-making, they outsourced their choices to the sacred animal observer, a specialist who watched a chicken peck at grain to determine if the gods approved of a declaration of war. This clay vessel is a clepsydra. Athenian courts needed a mechanical way to enforce limits. Water flowed from the top container to the bottom. Once empty, it signaled the objective end of the speech, cutting them off. By delegating uncontrollable variables like time and fate to inanimate objects or animals, ancient societies created a mechanical form of certainty that protected them from their own biases. In the tribal villages of Celtic Gaul, internal friction was a constant threat to unity, requiring a way to channel aggression without resorting to civil war. During Gaulish feasts, the champion's portion, the finest cut of meat, functioned as a deliberate trigger for status challenges. Warriors would claim the meat by boasting of their kills and ancestry. By turning lethal violence into a structured game of storytelling and drinking, the tribe could settle hierarchies without losing their best fighters to actual bloodshed. The Greeks managed the friction of physical proximity through specialist roles. Instead of cleaning himself, a wealthy athlete hired an attendant to professionally scrape the oil and sweat from his body with a bronze tool called a strigil. Even petty spite was bureaucratized. If a neighbor crossed you, you didn't physically assault them. You paid a curse writer to inscribe your grievances onto a lead tablet like this one and bury it, effectively outsourcing your revenge to the gods. Ritualizing insults, hygiene, and status competitions successfully trapped social friction inside predictable boundaries, preventing everyday grievances from escalating into systemic violence. Daily life in Athens was governed by strict social codes, legal hierarchies, and the constant pressure to maintain one's public standing. To handle the weight of shared trauma, the city hired professional mourners. These actors provided a scripted release of grief on demand, ensuring that the necessary emotions were displayed publicly without disrupting the private lives of the mourning family. The city's ultimate pressure valve was the Festival of Dionysus. For a few days, the state sanctioned the temporary suspension of all social rules and individual identities. Citizens used wine and rhythmic music to reach a state of ecstasis, standing outside the self. This allowed them to step away from their rigid roles as soldiers or merchants and experience a temporary collective freedom. Masked theater allowed the population to trade their private faces for a terracotta role. Whether playing a queen or a slave, citizens used these masks to lose their individual identities and fuse into a unified chorus. These planned periods of madness allowed the population to experience the edge of chaos and return to their daily lives with a renewed understanding of why social boundaries existed in the first place. Over time, survival tactics transformed into high culture. Narazushi's months of fermentation evolved into the precise, seconds-long discipline of modern sushi mastery. The wild release of the Dionysian festivals was eventually housed in the permanent stone tiers of the amphitheater, becoming the structured art of Western theater. While these ancient practices look absurd to a modern eye, they provided the structural consistency these cities needed to survive famines, wars, and internal dissent for centuries. We still perform our own versions of these rituals. We navigate status at corporate gatherings and use the internet to channel our collective need for public blame. The scaffold of modern life is still built upon the serious rituals we perform to keep the unpredictability of existence at bay. Even now, we are held together by the logic of the absurd.
Imagine navigating a world where the environment itself feels like an active threat. In Tudor England, survival meant treating the basic elements of daily life, the air you breathe and the water you drink, as invisible, lethal dangers. Take bathing, for example. Hot water was considered an immense risk. The prevailing medical consensus dictated that a hot bath would open the pores of your skin. Once those pores were unlocked, deadly, invisible vapors known as miasma could slip right into your body and kill you. The primary strategy for staying clean relied on layers. The Tudors wore tight, heavy linen undergarments directly against the skin. The linen absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt, acting as a wearable, disposable hygiene system, so the skin itself rarely needed washing. Water sources were equally suspect, often doubling as waste runoffs. The safest hydration alternative was small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew consumed all day by adults and children alike. While the Tudors were unaware of bacteria, the boiling process during brewing provided a functional safeguard that made beer safer than water. Every one of these daily choices traced back to a single medical framework, the theory of the four humors. Health meant keeping blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile in perfect equilibrium. A slight disruption in any direction meant severe illness. These routines were calculated adaptations. The Tudors were navigating the edge of their available knowledge to stay alive. But what happens when a single mind possesses insights that exceed the physical capacity of their time? Leonardo da Vinci is widely remembered for his art, but he operated extensively as a military and civil engineer. His notebooks reveal a mind designing highly complex mechanics, yet he was restricted to the materials of the Renaissance: wood, leather, and human muscle. He deconstructed bird flight into the mechanics of lift, drag, and controlled descent, mapping these concepts out centuries before the language of aerodynamics existed. Since sustained human flight required too much physical exertion for a human pilot, he reasoned that a person could at least control how they fell. He sketched a pyramid-shaped parachute to stabilize a drop from high altitudes, a structure modern testing proved functional. He applied that same mechanical logic to the battlefield. He drew circular, domed vehicles fitted with sloped armor to deflect incoming attacks, allowing a crew inside to fire cannons outward in all directions. He even explored the foundations of automation, drawing intricate systems of gears, springs, and levers intended to store and release energy over time. He was designing programmable motion long before the existence of the combustion engine. These blueprints were mechanically viable, but the Renaissance lacked the metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and fuel sources to build them. His ideas reached toward a world that did not yet have the tools to support them. Constrained by the physical materials of his era, Da Vinci shifted his engineering focus inward. He designed an illusion that manipulated human psychology. In the Mona Lisa, he used a technique called sfumato. By erasing the sharp boundaries around the mouth and eyes, he forced the viewer's brain into a loop. Your peripheral vision detects a smile in the shadows, but when you look directly at the lips, it vanishes. Your perception never settles on a single expression. For centuries, this psychological masterpiece was admired by historians, but largely ignored by the public. That changed in 1911, when visitors at the Louvre stared at a completely empty space on the wall. The painting had vanished, and its absence sparked global interest. The heist required no grand conspiracy. A former museum worker named Vincenzo Perugia simply lifted it from the wall, hid it under his clothes, and walked out. By the time it was recovered 2 years later, that simple crime had permanently fixed the artwork as a global icon. Da Vinci bypassed his era's physical limits by engineering an illusion in the mind. But what happens when radical belief physically collides with the power of a political court? When Joan of Arc was pulled from her horse outside Compiègne, her status shifted. To her enemies, she was no longer a battlefield threat. She was a controlled political problem. The English court aimed to do more than execute her. They needed to legally discredit her divine visions and destroy the foundation of her influence. If they could prove her claims were false, they could neutralize the inspiration she provided to French forces. They placed her in an ecclesiastical court, subjecting her to months of isolation and questioning.
The judges used the rigid rules of theology against a teenager, using the threat of the stake to force a confession. Under that pressure, she reached a breaking point. Facing the immediate reality of the flames, she signed an abjuration, a document that renounced her visions and submitted to the court's authority in exchange for her life. But the submission was temporary. Days later, Joan realized that surviving through a false version of her own story was a compromise she could not maintain. She reclaimed her claims of divine guidance, knowing that this reversal guaranteed her execution. In the market square of Rouen, she was burned alive. The authorities then had her ashes scattered to ensure no physical trace remained that could be preserved or remembered. They intended for her story to end there. Modern medicine eventually replaced the Tudor humoral theory. Industrial engineering turned Da Vinci sketches into functional hardware. And the court's attempt to erase Joan of Arc failed to stop her story from being retold and eventually vindicated. These boundaries shifted as knowledge and technology progressed, leaving behind the evidence of how each era attempted to navigate its own limitations.
The Iranian plateau is a place of harsh extremes, blistering summers and freezing winters. For the early tribes migrating there, survival demanded strict organization. Over time, leaders like Cyrus and Darius forged those stubborn survival instincts into the Achaemenid Empire, engineering a massive, centralized state machine out of scattered nomadic groups. This map illustrates the speed of the Achaemenid system. They standardized taxes across regions and engineered the Royal Road, a relay network of couriers capable of delivering information across continents in a matter of days. Then they built Persepolis. This was an architectural propaganda tool, carved from stone to physically intimidate visiting delegations. Conquered peoples had to walk up incredibly wide, shallow staircases. The layout forced them to move slowly and deliberately, ensuring they processed the overwhelming scale of Persian power before they ever reached the king. Every detail of the empire was engineered to project an image of absolute, unbreakable permanence. Then a young king from Macedon arrived and completely shattered that permanent image. Alexander the Great absorbed the Persian machine into his own rule, adopting local court customs and marrying into the defeated elite to blur the line between victor and subject. Yet his outward military success masked severe internal fragility. When his closest companion, Hephaestion, died, Alexander's paralyzing grief effectively ground the entire empire to a halt. As this map shows, the moment Alexander died at 32, his conquered world instantly shattered. His generals turned on each other and tore the territory into rival fragments. Centuries later, the Sasanian Empire resurrected that rigid Persian military dominance. But decades of exhausting wars drained their resources, leaving the centralized state to collapse entirely under the sudden expansion of Arab forces. If the most rigorously organized states and celebrated rulers can vanish off the map in a single generation, does anything in human history actually last? The control of fire is the true foundation of human civilization. It allowed early humans to soften tough plants and cook meat, making digestion efficient and turning basic survival into a shared experience. In Mesopotamia, cooks started writing their methods down, etching complex stew recipes into clay tablets that called for specific cuts of meat, leeks, and beer. Ancient Egypt structured the rhythm of its entire society around the massive industrialized production of bread and beer to sustain the workforce. The Egyptian system operated as a high-volume assembly line, prioritizing repetitive efficiency to keep millions of workers fed and functioning. Across the world in Mesoamerica, cooking took on religious weight. Ingredients like cacao were processed into bitter, frothy drinks reserved strictly for sacred elite rituals. The Romans institutionalized cooking directly into their city infrastructure. They built thermopolia, ancient fast food counters serving hot meals from large clay jars embedded right into public masonry. Armies redraw borders from the top down, but these quiet, daily routines built unbreakable cultural identities from the bottom up. Structured play also emerged as a vital pillar of legacy, providing a safe way to simulate the unpredictability of fate. The royal game of required players to balance careful planning against the random roll of a die, providing a physical manifestation of the limits of human agency. The Egyptians used sonnet to give their beliefs a physical form. Players moved their pieces across a grid to literally rehearse the soul's perilous journey through the afterlife. In ancient India, the invention of chaturanga stripped away luck entirely. It simulated military strategy, replacing dice with strict decision-making where every move carried direct consequences. In China, a board filled with black and white stones called Go taught scholars and generals patience, focusing on long-term spatial harmony and indirect territorial control. Games outlasted kingdoms through active, voluntary participation, a level of personal engagement that preserved these boards long after the rulers who played them were forgotten. When the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires collapsed, their political borders vanished from the maps, but the core cultural identities of the people remained intact. The Zoroastrian worldview and centuries of Persian administrative habits seeped into the new Islamic caliphates, quietly reshaping the new empires from within. Look at this map tracking the spread of chaturanga. It moves out of India, adapts in Persia, flows through the Islamic world, and mutates into the chess played in Europe today. Cultures survive conquest by absorbing their invaders and mutating from the inside out. The fast food counters on your street operate on the exact logic of Roman street food, and your kitchen relies on agricultural systems perfected in ancient Mesoamerica. Modern board games follow this same legacy. The landlord's game, the direct ancestor of Monopoly, used cardboard and rules to process the specific economic anxieties of its era. Hard power is a fragile, temporary illusion. The true, permanent legacy of human history lives on in the soft power of sharing a meal or playing a game.
If you wake up in ancient Egypt as a priest, your morning begins with a blade. Before you can perform a single ritual, you must remove every single hair from your body: head, beard, arms, and even your eyebrows. This was a necessity born of a relentless environment. In the heat of the Nile, hair trapped sweat and dirt, creating a perfect residence for parasites. Shaving wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was aggressive pest control, designed to prevent the infections that could end your story early. The Egyptians codified these health protocols into a doctrine called Ma'at, the pursuit of cosmic order and balance. By turning hygiene into a religious requirement, they ensured that survival wasn't left to individual choice. To be pure was to be clean, and to be clean was to be predictable. This strategy of masking survival as worship protected the civilization's most vital resources. Cats, which eliminated the rodents threatening the grain supply, were elevated to divine status. Tying their safety to the goddess Bastet meant that protecting the food supply became a spiritual obligation for every citizen. We see the same pattern in their cosmetics. The heavy lines of kohl around an Egyptian's eyes reduced sun glare and contained minerals with antibacterial properties. It was a functional shield against eye infections, presented to the world as a symbolic link to the protection of the gods. This obsession with order even dictated the terms of death. The belief that a soul must return to a body meant that physical decay was a threat to eternity. Mummification was the logical response, a high-effort project to ensure that identity and structure outlasted life itself. These religious mandates provided a predictable safety net in an unforgiving landscape. Ancient Egypt thrived by prioritizing collective survival through strict adherence to routine. But as these rules scaled up, they evolved into the primary tools used to govern entire empires. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the sanctuary of Delphi functioned as a geopolitical hub for the ancient Greek world. This was the specific point where kings and generals came to negotiate the fate of their kingdoms through divine consultation. The oracle, or Pythia, didn't provide clear instructions. She spoke in fragmented riddles that were translated by a group of highly educated priests. What the visitor received was a refined, poetic ambiguity that could be interpreted in multiple ways. This ambiguity acted as a psychological engine. Leaders facing the chaos of war projected their own hopes onto the vague messages.
If the campaign succeeded, the oracle was right. If it failed, the king had simply misunderstood the god's meaning. This system created massive political leverage. Wealthy city-states brought larger offerings to secure better positioning in the queue, ensuring they received the divine validation necessary to justify their decisions to their citizens. Power in the ancient world didn't require the ability to see the future. It only required the illusion of certainty, a system that convinced masses of people that their path was already ordained. Rulers often used architecture to cement this illusion.
In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian commissioned the Hagia Sophia as a declaration of absolute divine order, built at a scale that made the previous church look like a modest relic. Making a circular dome sit on a square base was an engineering risk. Architects used pendentives, curved triangular stone sections, to distribute the immense weight. By placing 40 windows at the dome's base, it appeared suspended by light, a miracle convincing witnesses of the divine. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, the building wasn't destroyed, it was captured. By hiding the mosaics and adding Islamic medallions, the new rulers layered their own religious authority directly onto the existing monument, using the building's grandeur to validate a new empire. Monuments like the Hagia Sophia survive because they are designed to be occupied. By bending to whoever holds power, the physical structure ensures the system of authority it represents remains unbroken, regardless of which flag flies outside. Nikola Tesla operated in defiance of these established systems. He possessed the ability to visualize fully functioning machines in his mind with such detail that he didn't need sketches or prototypes to test his ideas. When he arrived in New York in 1884, his mind collided with Thomas Edison's practical business model. Edison had built his reputation on direct current, a system already generating profit, but limited by how far its energy could travel. On the left, Edison's DC system requires a power plant in every neighborhood. On the right, Tesla's alternating current reverses direction rapidly, traveling hundreds of miles with less loss, powering entire regions from a single source. Backed by George Westinghouse, Tesla's system won the contract to power the 1893 World's Fair. Thousands of lights proved that AC was the superior technology, effectively ending the war of currents and defining how the modern world would be powered. But victory wasn't enough. Tesla's next project, Wardenclyffe Tower, was designed to broadcast energy and information wirelessly across the globe. He envisioned a world where electricity was as accessible as the air we breathe. This wasn't just an engineering upgrade. It was a total disruption of how civilization controlled fundamental resources. From the perspective of the status quo, Tesla's vision had a fatal flaw. If energy could be pulled from the air by anyone, there was no way to attach a financial meter to it. The financial establishment recognized the threat. J.P. Morgan abruptly cut off his funding, recognizing that a world of free wireless energy offered no room for the control required by a capitalist order. Tesla spent his final years in isolation, living in New York hotels he couldn't afford. The man who had literally powered the modern world was exiled from the very revolution he had initiated. Our world eventually adopted his technology, but only the parts, like metered AC power grids, that could be measured, controlled, and monetized by the system. From ancient religious laws to modern financial markets, we build rigid systems to protect us from an unpredictable world. But the irony is that these same systems are often engineered to crush the very visionary chaos required to build a better future.